Good morning. I wanted to share our Sunday message with you as YouTube Live would not work. But we're continuing our series through Esther. And we're in chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. And the title of today's message is One Person Can Make a Difference. Our church was saddened to learn this past week of the death of one of our most valuable members. Their name is someone else. Someone else's passing creates a vacancy that will be very difficult to fill. Someone else has been with us for many years, and for every one of those years, someone else did far more than a normal person share of work should ever be. Whenever there was a job to do, a class to teach, or a meeting to attend, one person was always looked to. Let's ask someone else to do it. Whenever leadership was needed, this wonderful person was looking to for inspiration as well as results. Someone else will get it done. It was common knowledge that someone else was among the most generous givers in the church. Whenever there was a financial need, everyone just assumed that someone else would make up the difference, as they usually did. Someone else was a wonderful person. Where the truth be known, everybody expected too much of someone else. Now someone else is gone. We wonder what we're going to do without someone else. The Jewish people in Esther's day also wondered what they were going to do. They wondered if someone else was going to come to their rescue. Last week, we learned that the Jews in Esther's day had been threatened with extermination. And we talked about how that there was, oh, they got trouble right there in Esther's city. The evil man Haman had been given the king's signet ring and therefore had the authority to have all the Jewish people destroyed, killed, and annihilated. A date for that destruction was chosen by casting lots, and the decree was written as a law of the Medes and the Persians, and it was irrevocable. So can you imagine the hopelessness, the helplessness the Jewish people must have felt at this point? Yet in the midst of all this, God was not sleeping. He was there in the invisible ink. In God's sovereign plan, he determined that he would put one person in a position to make a difference for this horrific plan that be put into place. And that one person is Esther. And look at how far in advance God began working out this plan. It was in the third year of King Xerxes' reign, right, where he removed Queen Vashti. She disobeyed. She was removed from her office. And that began the 1 year Miss Persia contest, right? Or the Bachelor Persia edition. And the culminated of that was Esther being chosen. Esther has been queen for about 8 years now because Haman's wicked plan was made law in the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign. So the big question is, will Esther step forward and make a difference? Or will she, like us and like Moses long ago, ask God to get someone else? We read in Esther 4, verse 1, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. What do you think of Mordecai's behavior? It's kind of silly, really. But well, you got to understand that was culture, that was custom back in this day and time and place. When people in Esther's day wanted to express their grief, they wore loose-fitting, dark-colored, coarse garments made of goat's hair, which hung off them like large burlap bags. Then they would take the ashes and the remains of a fire and throw them on themselves to be covered with them and appear ghastly and unclean. And sometimes they'd even sit in the midst of the cold ash heap of ashes. They would then loudly lament and wail all day long. So this is what Mordecai did. He held back nothing. Before we move on in the story, I just want to touch about grief. Although there's no right or wrong way to handle grief, I wonder if the way Esther's culture handled it was more helpful than the way we do. Think about it. In our culture today, we are conditioned to keep our grief more private. We might be going through a family problem, a loss of a loved one, maybe facing cancer. And if someone asks you how you're doing, we usually reply with, "I'm fine. I'm I'm okay." Now, I know we don't have to spill our guts out. I call it verbal vomiting, or bare our soul when everyone ever asks how we're doing. But would it be better if we could be more open about our grief and sorrow that we might be experiencing? Allowing others to help bear our burdens not only helps us tremendously, but also is a blessing and a gift for other people to be allowed to be close to us and to be there for us. But let's go on with our story. We look at verse 2. But he went only as far as the king's gate because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter in. The king was a lot like some people we know, right? They don't want to hear or see anything that would bring them down. They don't want to be a part of any bad news. So the king didn't listen to CNN or MSNBC. He didn't go on Facebook to read all the negative posts. He just didn't want any part of it at all. Wouldn't allow anyone in the palace who was grieving. So Mordecai knew that he wouldn't be allowed to go past the king's gate. But he wanted to get as close to it as possible. Perhaps he wanted to get the attention of his niece, Queen Esther. For it is doubtful that Esther even knew what was going on about this horrible edict. See, Esther lived secluded, right? She was in a highly protected environment of a harem, locked away from all the concerns and troubles of the common people. We learn that Mordecai was not the only one who was publicly mourning this edict. We look at verse 3. It says, in every province to which the edict was ordered of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews. With fasting and weeping and wailing, many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So try to imagine this picture of widespread sorrow and loud mourning. I mean, the closest thing we can ever come to experiencing this is after a natural disaster. You know, a devastating hurricane, a horrendous tornado, massive flooding, maybe 9/11 bombing or the Boston bombing, right? A lot of weeping and mourning. But what's cool is that when disaster strikes, people come together. They come together to grieve and help each other out like no other times. And after experiencing Hurricane of Florida, one person said, it blew down all our fences and we finally got to meet our neighbors. That's what disaster does. It brings people together. So here's a thought to think about. Suffering and hardship has never ruined a nation, but peace and prosperity have. We learn more and we grow more during hard times rather than through good times. We continue on to verse 4. When Esther's maids and eunuch came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes to him to put on instead of the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. So Esther didn't know why Mordecai was mourning, nor did she know about the edict. And here's a good lesson for us here. We should not assume anything. Don't assume. Sometimes we assume that people know something or know about something, but that is often not the case. We shouldn't assume that the preacher is aware of what is going on, because oftentimes the preacher is the last one to know. We shouldn't assume that our friends know what has happened to us or how we feel. Sometimes we are hurt or offended when someone doesn't lend a helping hand or support when they should, but in reality, sometimes they don't even know that it's needed. Why? Because they don't know. We assume. So when Esther heard that Mordecai was mourning, she wondered what was going on. Being a part of the king's household, she was not allowed to speak to Mordecai directly. So, well, she sent him some clothing to replace his sackcloth, perhaps as a way of offering comfort to him for whatever he was going through. When Mordecai refused the clothing, Esther sent one of the king's servants to find out why Mordecai, her uncle, was doing what he was doing. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went to Mordecai in an open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay to the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave Hathach a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa to show to Esther and explain to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. So Mordecai laid it all out for Esther. He told her about Haman's evil plan and about the exact amount of money that Haman promised to put into the king's treasury. Just so she knew he wasn't exaggerating, he sent along unofficial evidence, a copy of the text of the edict. And I'm sure Mordecai said something like this: "Hey, have your queen read this and have her notice that it is signed with the king's signet ring." Wow. So Mordecai carefully covered all his bases. He had volatile information the queen needed to know, but he also knew that he had to put the issue on the line for Esther. So Mordecai asked her to go to the king and plead for mercy for her people. I'm sure Mordecai knew that what he was asking her to do was a risky move for her and for her people. But what else could be done? How did Esther respond to the news of Haman's plan and Mordecai's request? Well, let's look at verse 10. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman to approach the king in the inner courts without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend a gold scepter to him to spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I have called to go to the king," as I was called. So Esther wasn't sure Mordecai knew what he was asking of her to do. So she sent him this proverbial yes, but. We've all heard those yes, buts, right? If Esther obeyed Mordecai, she stood to risk everything, including her life. Although the king was her husband, she couldn't just stroll into his office and casually unload what's on her mind. That's not how it worked in Persia. You didn't appear before the king unless you were called. And it had to be after 30 days. You couldn't do it within 30 days of being called. And polygamy must have caused and compounded this situation as well. Now, there's an interesting picture that was found in an ancient archaeological dig, and it showed a Persian king sitting on his throne, and behind him was the guard with an enormous axe. And how's that for intimidation? I mean, if anyone would appear before the king without being summoned, the guard was ready to whoosh, chop off his head. So if Esther went before the king without being summoned, he could have put her to death. And on top of all that, she was Jewish. So who knows how that Gentile monarch, her husband, the king, would have responded when he found out that his wife, his queen, was a Jew. But before we judge Esther as maybe being too cowardly, I want you to think about times when maybe you were a coward yourself. You knew what had to be done, what was right to be done, but you were kind of skittish to do it. I mean, it's easy to be brave when we're protected and secure and when we have nothing to lose. But when something is really on the line, we're inclined to rationalize, right? By saying, well, but I could lose my job. Yeah, but I could lose my best friend. But I could lose my boyfriend or my girlfriend. I mean, yeah, but I might look foolish. I don't want to come across as a preacher who wears rose-colored glasses, because I don't. I know that things don't always come out rosy when you make the right decision. God's rewards aren't always dispensed in this world, right? Some people who have stood for what was right have suffered for it. So this was a huge dilemma for Esther. And it was for us, and it is for us when we faced similar challenges. But Mordecai knew Esther because he had raised her. Mordecai knew Esther's character. He knew how far he could push her. So what would Mordecai say in response to Esther's reply? This is one of the greatest moments in the story of Esther. Let's look at verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to the royal position for such a time as this. This go down in history as one of those turning point speeches. Mordecai made three compelling points. He made it clear that if she did nothing that would not guarantee her safety, being a Jew, she would most likely be killed with the rest of them. Second, Mordecai expressed his faith that God was not limited to just her, and that God would use someone else to save his people. Finally, Mordecai emphasized the possibility that Esther might be the one that God had chosen, that God has placed in this position to save his people. Could it be that this explains why Esther has been chosen to be queen for such a time as this, for this very moment? Mordecai basically says, Esther, this is your hour. Stand, speak, and perhaps die, but whatever you do, don't be silent. How would you have responded if you were Esther? I mean, look at her response. Then Esther sent this reply in verse 15. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. In Esther's response, we see her true color. And man, they are brilliantly bold. Her words reveal enormous faith mixed with courage. Esther determined to make a difference, no matter what the personal consequences might be. She has reached her own personal hour of decision and has not been found wanting. Even though her reply was not couched in religious language, it was a confession of faith. By asking all the Jews in Susa to join her in fasting, she acknowledged her need for God and her need for support from her fellow Jews, God's people. And even though prayer is not mentioned, it usually accompanies fasting. We see it all throughout the Old Testament. The whole point of fasting was to prepare oneself for communion with God and to render the prayer experience more effective. So as you notice that this was an extreme fast, it lasted 3 days, not just the 1 day customary fast we read about. It involved eating and drinking nothing during 3 days. And it involved doing it night and day. You see, many of the Jewish fasts and other religious fasts are only done during the daylight hours, when the sun rises until the sun sets. And after the sun sets, well, then they can eat. But this is not the case here. Mordecai went and carried out Esther's instructions. All the Jewish people of Susa fasted for 3 days along with Esther and her maids. When the 3 days are over, Esther will appear before the king, uninvited. What will happen to Esther? What will happen to God's people? We'll have to wait till next Sunday to find out. So I want to make one huge point through all this, one application for our lives, and that is this: we can all make a difference. In an overpopulated world, it is easy to underestimate the significance of one person. There are so many people who have so many gifts and skills who are already doing so many things that are so important. So we might think, well, who needs me? We wonder, what can I do as one individual to contribute to the overwhelming needs of this world? It is so easy to allow the vastness of our surroundings and the vastness of needs to do a number on us, isn't it? But the truth is that every one of us is a unique creation of God. Richard Fuller said, never forget that you are one of a kind. Never forget that if there weren't any need for you and all your uniqueness to be on this earth, you wouldn't be here in the first place. And never forget, no matter how overwhelming life's challenges and problems seem to be, that one person can make a difference in this world. In fact, it is always because of one person that all the changes that matter in the world